So welcome everybody to this session of outdoor learning in the curriculum for Wales. And this is our 9th session. And if you haven't been to any of the others, then they are available. And I'm actually starting to repeat some of them as well, because people have been asking, but I'll tell you more about that at the end, or if we don't have time, you can always look on the Eventbrite page for what's going on there. So what we're going to be focusing on today is practical ideas to teach the humanities area of learning and experience. And it is a big one. There is an awful lot of content within it, but we're trying to get through it all, hopefully. Just a bit of housekeeping to start with. Please keep your microphones on mute. If you've got any questions, please put them in the chat. If we don't get around to answering them, I will keep the chat and I will email you any answers I have after the event, but we will hopefully have time to stop and have a bit of a discussion, or at least me answering some questions. Also, as I said, I will be recording the session. This recording will be sent to you as soon as I've finished it and as soon as it's been finalized, and then you'll have that for as long as you like. If I'm sending it to you through Hub, then I might put you on a Hub group, and that means that you will have access to it through Hub all the time. If you're not on Hub, or if I don't have your Hub email address, please do send me your Hub email address, because it's a lot easier sharing documents on Hub, especially big ones like a PowerPoint presentation. I also, if I haven't got your Hub account, or if you haven't got a Hub account, I'll be sending it to you through WeTransfer. Now, WeTransfer, you'll get it sent, but there will be a time limit on it. That's the way WeTransfer works. So that if you don't download it after a week, I think it is, then you'll lose it. If that happens, please email me again and I will send you it again. But if you get that WeTransfer email, just download it. And the video will be a link to a YouTube channel, so an unlisted YouTube video, so you'll be able to see it at any point as long as you keep hold of that that link. Chat function, use that if you want to ask any questions. If I don't see it, I do apologize. I will try and keep on top of that, but we will stop a couple of times for that. We won't be doing any breakout rooms today. We just don't have time. I do apologize. So the aim of today's session, so what we're going to do is we're going to go through all of the what matters statements for the humanities AOLE and looking at how progression occurs through each of the what matters statements. And I'm going to give you practical ideas for teaching each of the what matters statements using the outdoors as a resource. And I'm also going to cover the key considerations for the area, because if you haven't seen the curriculum, you'll see that there's a lot of content within that. So we'll be covering that as well. The practical ideas, we're going to be going through what matters statement 1, which is all about the inquiry process, 2, which is about the human experience, and then 3 is about the natural world, 4 is really about human society, and 5 is it's got a bit of ethics, but it's also about social considerations as well. And then at the end, because of the content within the key considerations for this area, there's also a lot about geographical skills, which isn't in the what matters statement. So I think that's really important because that's really easy to teach outdoors. So I'm going to be going through that separately at the end as well. So there's a lot. I could actually do a whole session on that, but we'll try and get as much of that done as possible. Hopefully that makes sense to you. So that is our plan. So just a bit of an outline now, just a quick reminder, just in case you aren't aware of too much about the new curriculum. So the humanities area of learning experience, the area is divided into 5 what matters statements. And as with all of the areas, they are all covered, they're all sorted into 5 progression steps. So progression step 1 is you're meant to achieve equivalent to at the end of reception. 2 is about the end of key stage 1, so kind of year 3. Step 3 is end of key stage 2, so year 6, and 4 is end of key stage 3, and 9 and 5 is the end of year 11, but they haven't written that, so don't worry about that. We are going to be focusing more on 1, 2, and 3, but I will be mentioning 4 and 5, so don't freak out if you think you're a primary school teacher and that's not relevant to me, because of the geographical inquiry process is the same process you use throughout geography up into degree. And I've got some resources that I've created for A-levels and GCSEs, which can actually be used for you as teachers to teach your youngsters in geography inquiry process lower down. So don't worry if I start talking about something that's way beyond your progression step. It's all going to be filtered down and make sense as I'm doing it, hopefully. We've also got these key special considerations for each area, and there's quite a lot of key considerations for the area of humanities. There's a lot of content in humanities because it covers the subjects of geography, history, religious values and ethics, social studies, and business studies, which really is just a huge amount to put under one heading. So there's so much content, and not all of it, I'd say, is relevant to outdoor learning. So I'm going to be focusing in on the skills in the key considerations, which are all around the inquiry process, and that's in both geography and history. And I'm also going to touch on the other subjects in the key considerations that link well into outdoor learning. So if there's something that's not relevant, or if I'm shoehorning it into outdoor learning, that's a waste of my time and yours. So I might say, this really not useful outdoors, we won't go into this, and you just teach it inside. Right, so this is the humanities side. This is the history side of the humanities special considerations. So this is not in the what matters statement. This is in a separate part of the same document. So if you haven't found the special considerations part of the AOLEs in the curriculum, then please do look them up, because there's a lot of detail in there of what they're expecting you to cover that isn't necessarily in the what matters statement. So if you look at it, the most important one is the first one. And that's the same for all of the subjects within humanities. You want to develop an understanding and the value of that subject. So in this case, history. And then it goes through what they expect you to do. And some of that is within the what matters statement, like the chronology, the different time periods, understanding source-based skills, the range of historical periods. But there's also some that isn't in the what matters statement. So things about leadership, diversity, and culture. That's more broader. There's more specifics that you need really for that. The geography side, the special considerations in the geography part, is got a whole list of what they expect you to cover, which is important because if it's not in the what matters statement, you might miss it out, because the what matters statement geography aspects are, I wouldn't say they're really obviously geography. They are so much humanities and skills based and understanding of processes. There's not the detail of the content you need to cover. So this is the only place within the area where it actually mentions that content. So things that you would automatically be teaching probably, but just to, kind of reassure you that you are meant to be teaching these things. So obviously, we've got this really important develop and understanding of value of geography, but we're also looking at landscapes, sustainability, climate change, food security, population, migration, all the things that you expect to cover in geography. They are here, not necessarily mentioned in the what matters statements. We have also got the very important special considerations for the skills aspects of geography. So in terms of geography, we've got so many skills they could have placed in it, but they really just have two skills. And the skills is the skill of undertaking inquiries, and the other one is mapping skills. So the inquiry skills and what's required to undertake a geographical inquiry is all covered by what matters statement 1. But the mapping skills is actually not covered by any of the what matters statements. So I'm going to go through some ideas for that later on, but it just shows that if you're trying to map in the, with your what matters statements, what you're doing, and you're doing a whole load of mapping, you won't find any of those what matters statements to link it to, but it is there. It's in this special considerations aspect of the curriculum. The next one is this RVE, this religious values and ethics. And again, a huge topic here and so much that you need to cover, but I'm just going to focus on the ones that are relevant to outdoor learning, which are things like this experiences of awe and wonder in a range of meaningful real world contexts. You really can't do that without getting out there and seeing that and getting that awe and wonder. They've also got that nature of life and the world around them. So if you've got that world view, you need to be out there in the view. We've also got this kindfen. This kindfen is so important, underlying a lot of the what matters statements, but also underlying the 4 purposes. So that is really the whole aspect of the new curriculum is about this kindfen. So even though it's just mentioned here, The whole of the curriculum is pointing at this, and I'll explain more about what it is, but really it's that sense of belonging to somewhere. That's what it really means. And we've also got these ethics and responsibilities which come with being outdoors and being respectful and interacting with the outside world in a respectful and responsible way. So those are the aspects we're going to be covering in the bit of the RVE that we're going to be putting in the What Matters statement. We're not going to be looking at things like ultimate questions. That's not going to be something that you can do necessarily outdoors or make it any more relevant going outdoors. The next subject, the key considerations, is we've got the social studies aspect. Now, this links very well with the What Matters Statement 5, and there is a bit kind of tagged along the bottom, which I think is really, really useful and really important in that What Matters statement, which I've never seen in a curriculum before. And it's a practical aspect of social action. And that is a fantastic opportunity to really have an impact and a legacy, but also affecting the wider community and how you have a positive impact on the wider community. So these learners are not only learning for themselves, but they're also having an impact with their actual actions. So that's something that we'll be covering when we get to What Matters Statement 5. And then we've got the business study side of it. Now, again, this is something that I've actually covered when we did about the numeracy, maths and numeracy AOLE, when you, and some of the science investigations, when you can introduce a level of business planning to any inquiry or any problem solving thing that you were doing. So for example, if you're asking them to build an extension or build a fence or paint a fence, you can build in some business in there by adding that they've got to follow a budget, they've got to write a business plan. But I'm not going to go through anything in terms of business studies in this because I don't want to repeat what I've done in the other one. And also it's not the most important thing for teaching with outdoor learning. As well as those parts of the key considerations, see, we haven't even got to the What Matters statement here yet. We've also got mentioned in the curriculum for the humanities, actually some outdoor learning that they actually want you to do. So they've actually said that they want you to be outdoors and experiencing and reflecting on the wonders of the natural world. So that's really important. They've actually got it in there. So that means we've got an excuse to go out and we know that we're going to be covering the content. So looking at this aspect of the key considerations, you can see what they are focusing on. They're basically wanting you to be there and to experience. So we're looking at this E part of the AOLE. So experiencing the natural world and the landscapes around it, experience the history, experiencing field work and undertaking that practical side, and actually embedding that by actually going wider than just your local learning area, by going on visits and exploring areas and special places that link in with what you're learning. So it's really, really brilliant that I've seen this. In fact, when they put the draft out, they had learning outdoors in health and well-being as well. And I wrote in and said, that's brilliant, please put it into all of them. Unfortunately, when they did the revised one, they got it out of health and well-being, which is not good, but it's a really good go-to place to find a really good focus for your outdoor learning. So What Matters Statement 1. This is what we're going to be going through. Every single one of our What Matters statements, we are going to be considering what the progression steps are, and I'm going to link in with some really good activities that will help you to teach that What Matters statement to the different progression steps. So the first one, this What Matters Statement 1, if you haven't seen this layout before, what I've done is I've taken the What Matters statement from Hub, so from the curriculum. I've simplified it slightly, taking out any terminology that's going to be not very useful for non-specialists. And I've also succinctly made it so that you can see it all on one piece of paper. So on this What Matters statement, this table covers everything you need to cover in What Matters Statement 1. The problem I find with that Hub version of the curriculum is you're clicking to get to the next progression step, and you can lose where you are from the previous one. So you don't see the progression from the previous progression step. So this shows you it all on one location. So you can see where your learners have come from and where they're going to. So this What Matters Statement 1 is all about the inquiry process. Now, the great thing about the humanities inquiry process is that you can differentiate it across all progression steps. Even with the same inquiry question, you could say that at progression step 1, and then you can learn and you can actually undertake it at progression step 2, 3, 4, or even 5. Now, if you haven't heard of the inquiry process, this is the inquiry process. This process goes on throughout all geography, and it goes into degree level. Nothing changes apart from the detail and the amount of independence you use. So you start with posing a question. So this is an inquiry question, something that is not obvious, like, you know, what color is the grass? Something that you don't know the answer to, but you need to try and do something to find the answer to. So we then collect some data to try and answer that question. We process that data, could be sorting it, could be doing a bit of maths, numeracy, present it in a way so you can see trends or look for patterns. You then interpret that data to try and make sense of those patterns, looking for correlations or relationships. Draw your conclusions, so bring it all together to try and answer your question. And then you evaluate the process by looking back and saying, all right, the data I collected, I didn't have enough to answer my question. It's not very accurate, it's not very reliable, or the question actually was a bit inaccurate, I needed more detail. And that the whole process is meant to be a cycle, so that when you evaluate the process, you actually come up with more questions, which then provide you with the next lot of questions that you then do your next inquiry. So that's the inquiry process. So what they've done in the What Matters Statement 1 is that they have used that inquiry process and teased out different parts of it and given them to different progression steps, so that you have this hierarchy of building on the first stage and the second stage, so that by the time you get to progression step 5, the learners are doing all 5 stages completely independently and to great detail. So for progression step 1, you just start with something like asking simple questions. And this is going to be based on their play or their exploring and their experiences and discovery. So they're just asking questions. Then at progression step 2, this starts to be a bit more structured. So they ask the questions, but then they start answering it by undertaking exploring different stimuli. So they have a good play, have a look and have an explore, and then respond to a range of questions, and they start to undertake this process. So they can collaborate or they can work in groups. They're not trying to do this independently, but they're trying to grow a bit more independence and a bit more confidence in the process. So they're probably focusing on really simple inquiry questions and collecting and recording some simple data, maybe sorting it a bit and maybe doing some grouping their findings, presenting it in some simple graphs like bar graphs, and then coming up with a simple conclusion, a simple answer to that first question. The progressions, this What Matters Statement 1 also covers something from the old national curriculum science subject, which is this concept of facts and beliefs, which I always found teaching it through the science and scientific process was actually really tricky. It wasn't the right place for it. So I'm very pleased they've moved this into this inquiry process in the humanities. So that's makes much more sense, because it all leads into the reliability of your data, which is what inquiry is all about. When you get to progression step 3, the changes are that we have much more independence. So the students are trying to do things more on their own, coming up with their own process. So they're finding out their own way of collecting data or coming up with their own questions. They're also being exposed to a greater range of inquiry types, so different types of questioning, different types of data collection. And it also mentions that learners are to be actively engaged with a range of stimuli, which is compared to in the progression step 1 and 2, where they've just had experience. So there is still this really important focus on a practical approach to the inquiry process and experiencing, not just writing it up. You actually have to be out there and do that, which is great. And they want you to use appropriate methods in gathering information, which leads to a wider range. So we're increasing in our breadth of data collection techniques, and they're trying to interpret this in great detail. And then they're asking that the data be shown in a variety of contexts. So again, just broadening out. Then they're going to present their findings in different ways. They've got a greater experience of data presentation techniques, so different types of graphing, different ways of collecting and presenting the data, and quality and quantitative as well as qualitative. And then when you get to progression step 4, we're building again, we're getting more independence. They're generating their own inquiry questions. There's researching and framing their questions based on their experience. And to be honest, you can't get to that point unless you've been exposed to a range of different inquiry types at the other progression steps. So this is really laying the foundation for them. So when you get to progression steps 4, they're really focusing on stage 3 to 6 of the inquiry process. Unfortunately, less of the practical side. So they're lots more on the reflecting, looking at reliability, looking for patterns, and trying to come up with the conclusions based on their data. And then when you get to progression step 5, basically much more independence, much more thorough, and they're really critically evaluating their data and refining their methods. So we can provide more challenge in teaching the inquiry process by increasing those two things, the independence of the students and the in-depth analysis and reflection of the inquiry process. So how are we going to actually teach the inquiry process using the outdoors with our cohorts? So the inquiry process, the foundation lies outdoors. So it's actually really difficult to teach the inquiry process from scratch inside. So the best way is to really just to get them to encourage them to ask questions about the world around them. So at progression step 1, this is really going to involve exposing your learners to a range of environments, and that allows them to play and explore and develop questions, but also provide them with important features of this RVE, so this religious values and ethics aspect of the area, this awe and wonder. So if they don't experience awe and wonder, then how can they ask pertinent questions? So through your continuous provision or your enhanced provision, you need to provide stimulation to inspire questioning. So here's just a few ideas of things that you might actually be undertaking already in your continuous provision, but I'm just going to identify how you get them to ask those pertinent inquiry-based questions. So you might be giving them things like windmills or kites or flags, and then getting them to explore how to make them go faster. So how they'll make the windmill go faster and why is it? And start asking those questions about how these things are changing and whether it's to do with location, whether it's to do with the environment. So just making that link between that. You can provide ways to explore the natural landscape. Now, obviously, in a continuous provision, you can't get them going all the way around your school ground, exploring it. So you can do it in a controlled method by creating models for it. Now, you probably do this already using gutters and things, but it's getting them to appreciate that you're then relating that to a real world example. So it's key is to give them the opportunity to try and ask those questions. So when you've got the guttering out, or if you've got water and you're playing with water, then provide them things like sand and pebbles and small world houses or Lego, so that they can then explore with making rivers or moving stuff with that water. You can also create beaches as well. So if you've got small world, you can add animals to your small world beach. So tough tray with some water and some sand, but then think about animals that belong there and animals that don't. So put a lion in amongst your sharks in the water. So they start questioning, oh, why isn't the lion there? Oh, why do lions live in beaches? Well, why aren't they living in beaches? Why aren't they in the sea? And it's just getting that inquiry thought going. And you could also add litter to get them starting to think about things like the sea plastic. You could add ice cubes, thinking about polar bears and melting ice caps. There's just tweaking a bit of what you're probably already doing, and getting them the opportunity to ask those questions is key. Also, providing with sand, they can actually start to create things. If you can get them to start building some of these landforms, so it could build the coast, and you can start to have that erosion process happening. And again, they don't have to know the terminology, but if they're building an island, or get them to build an archway, or any landscape you can think of, and then put small world animals around it, and just get that understanding of habitat and what lives where, but also how things change over time. Rain collectors, a great way to study rain is just giving them some things to collect rain with, and that doesn't have to be anything. It could be a tarp, could be umbrellas, anything that just gets them to focus in and start asking questions. Oh, can I get more rain if I go under the tree or if I come out into the yard? Rocks and fossils, children love playing with rocks and fossils, but again, if you put it in context, so you almost bury them inside sand, with dinosaurs, then they have to discover them. And again, it starts getting to them to think about, well, why aren't we haven't got any dinosaurs anymore? You know, and how has the world changed? So you're thinking about that time frame as well, the chronology. Soil and digging as well. Children love digging, but if you give them a reason for digging as well. So we're trying to explore what's under our feet. So again, providing them with stimuli for a number of questions. And a great way to tap into this is to feed off their enthusiasm for things like Minecraft. And of course, you're starting to mine to see if you can find any of those rocks. So if you place some of those rocks that they've got in Minecraft in your soil area or in a digging area, and they're finding quartz and they're finding obsidian, it's, you know, they're relating what they're doing in probably at home on their iPad to the real world. And that is where you bring the geography in. A great way of also bringing in some history is archaeological digs. So it depends on what you're planning to do in terms of your history. So it could be that you've chosen a time frame and you can create a archaeological dig in a sandpit and just hiding some items there which are relevant to the time frame you are, so that they can discover and start asking questions on it. So if you're doing Romans, then you can put little toy soldiers in. You could put saber-toothed tiger models in. You could put little shields. And don't forget the nearer history as well, the more recent history. So old telephones, you know, not little bricks of a mobile phone. Again, that'd be amazing. Tape cassettes, things like this that these children would not have ever seen before. Old cars, not just new cars, old cars. So hiding these in, and they're discovering them by going back in time, going down through the layers of your sand. So this might be some continuous provision activities that you're already undertaking, but the key to making sure they're trying to get this questioning is to get them to ask questions. So you're exposing them to the stimuli, and you need to then get them to relate this concept to the real world. So this thing that you're modeling, so asking things, so talking about rivers and the sea when they're playing with the water. And when they're experimenting with flowing water or with the static water in your beaches, ask questions like, well, can you get the water to move the sand? And where did the sand end up? And what about pebbles? Can you get the pebbles to move with the water? So this sometimes just a bit of reframing and getting your TAs and your teachers to ask the right questions when you've got your continuous provision out there. Moving on to the actual inquiry process. So when we get on to progression step 2, when we're thinking about actually trying to collect some data and actually work our way through that inquiry process, we need to get them to start looking at the world and asking questions. Now, just going out there and asking, and try and come up with a question about what you're seeing is very difficult. So it helps to give them a geographical or a historical lens. And what that means is literally something to look through to focus them in. So even though the inquiry process is usually really only covered in geography, you can do it with history as well. It's exactly the same process, but your data might be more evidence-based, but the whole process can be done with history as well. So when I mean a lens is you can actually physically give them a lens with the word geography or history written on it, and they can start to narrow down what they see. Or it could be a specific aspect of geography. So this picture here has got an inclusive written at the top. I know these are older pupils, but you might have one which says energy or pollution or sustainability. And then you're literally walking around either your school grounds or your school or your local learning area and looking through it and trying to find something that represents something relating to that aspect of the topic. And then you could take a photo and then, or you could ask a question based on what you can see inside that lens. So this could be simply asking a question like, well, what can you see? And then thinking, right, well, how are we going to answer that question? Yeah, we can just say what we see. We could take a picture of what we see. We could count what we see. So what they're actually doing, and what's really, really good foundation in humanities, is to get them to come up with their own inquiry process. If they work out the inquiry process involves certain stages, then they'll understand the relevance of it. So they might actually start recognizing the similarity to the scientific process and the scientific method. And yes, there is similarity, but it's important to explain that the inquiry process is much more open in what the questions that you can ask and the methods in which you can use and to find the answer. So you're much broader in what you can ask. You can ask anything really. So hopefully they don't feel that they have to structure it in the way you do for a science investigation, because questioning can be really broad. Observation. So one of the most important things to draw on in the inquiry is this interaction between people and the natural world. Now, if you're observing an animal moving around, then that's science. But if you're observing how people react to a landscape or interact with it, that's geography. And if you're looking at how people used to do that, that's history. So you can look for inspiration for questions by just observing what people are doing. Now, in your local area, you can see how people are behaving, and you don't have to go anywhere. You can stand at your school gate. So think about how they're crossing the road, how they meet other people, how they're undertaking activity like shopping or driving. And this can also be done in your school grounds. So you're observing the movement and the activity of the learners or visitors or the staff. It doesn't really matter who you're observing, as long as they're interacting with the natural world or the built up environment. And everyone's got to really. So, and that will provide you with the source of loads of questions. So for example, why did they not use the rubbish bin? That's a starter question. And then why did that person use that shop? Why is that car driving that fast? Why are they not carrying an umbrella or wearing a coat? So just observing that will bring you some question ideas which can start off the inquiry process. The next thing you can do is you can explore the natural world. So inquiry questions arise when you really focus in on the natural world. So obviously it depends on what landscape features you have in your school grounds or local learning area. And depending on what landscape questions and habitats will inspire you. But again, it doesn't have to be anything amazing. You don't have to have mountains and glaciers and volcanoes in your school grounds for you to come up with some really good questions. So just trying to reduce down the aspirations to a smaller scale. Like, why is that lump there in our school grounds? Why are the trees on the south side bigger than the other trees on the north side? So just trying to look at your school grounds with that geography eye and that questioning side will provide you with some inquiry questions. You can also undertake surveys. So especially in the man-made environment. Now this can generate some inquiry questions. So thinking about what you can see. So doing a survey and finding out where all the litter is and where it's been deposited. What is it, the litter? You know, what type of litter it is. Looking at the children playtime. Where are they liking to play? Where do they tend to play? What do they do in different areas? Why is it wet in certain areas? You could survey the moisture levels in your school grounds, especially in your yard. Why do you always get a puddle there? And where does the rain go? Does it stay in a certain place? Have you got certain places that kind of absorb the water? So just having an observation and doing some surveys of things like the water or the people and the interactions in your school grounds and the man-made features can provide you with some questions. Using old photos of an area that you're going to visit can be a fantastic way of generating inquiry questions about the past and the present and how it's changed. So if you've got pictures, and there's a great website called Geograph. Now, all the websites I'll mention today are all on the Padlet. I've put a link to the Padlet in the chat, but it will also be on the PowerPoint presentation. So when I send it, you can click on it. So the Padlet has got these fantastic resources that are all online, and Geograph has got, if you put in I think it's a mile square, just put in that mile square and you'll find photos that people have put on there from that 1 mile square, and they're from the present day and they can be from the past. So a great activity is called re-photography. So this photo on the bottom right is a re-photograph. So this is a photograph from World War II in Russia, but that's the middle bit. And then the outside bit is modern day. So they've actually cut and pasted it around each other. But what you try and do is you take the photo from the location where that old photo was taken in the same place, and you can look at how it's changed over time. You can also use Google back in time. So Google Earth, if you look at Street View, you can go back in time and you can see how shops have changed. If you take photos of your local shopping area, go back in time on Google Street View, you can compare your photos when you were there to photos in the past, and some of them go back to 1990, so you can see how it's changed in the last few decades. But if you get old photos, especially of your school grounds, try and re-photograph them, you can see how the school grounds has changed as well. Field sketching, that is a field sketch here, that picture there. Now, if this is a really good way of looking in detail at a landscape, so it can be done really well through field sketching because you can focus in on what's important. Now, remember, field sketching is not an art activity. It's about focusing the eye on the geography in the view and labeling what you can see and looking for questions in the picture. It's not about how good you can actually draw it. And then lastly, just letting your students explore with really basic geographical equipment is a great way of getting them to generate questions. So getting them to come back, not with data, but with questions. So send them off with a wind meter, send them off with a tape measure, send them off with a kilometer. And they come back asking things like, well, why is the wind fastest in the field? And why are there less plants in the footpath? And why is the building hotter than the trees? So those are all different ways in which you can produce some really good inquiry questions by using a variety of different methods. Another way to generate inquiry questions is using this Gilbert's 8-way thinking challenge. So from this table, you can come up with inquiry questions using all of your senses and looking at both the physical and the human parts of the location. So it's a fantastic result. I'm not going to go through it there, but that just gives you some great questions to ask and getting them to identify using that process. So what kind of inquiry questions might be suitable for the different progression steps so that you can access all parts of the inquiry process at their level? Now, I'm going to go through some inquiries and indicate how they can be adapted for progression step 1 or extended for progression step 3 and 4. Now, I've divided them by themes that you might be covering in school, but obviously the themes that you're all choosing now with the new curriculum vary hugely. So I couldn't possibly work out what everybody was going to cover, but hopefully you can tweak these so that they fit into your themes and the actual inquiry question is relevant, but don't try and shoehorn it in. The best thing is to actually come up with your own inquiry question, and I'll give you some tools for that a bit later. So if you do want to come up with your own inquiry question, I have created a inquiry question generation app, which I created for WJEC for GCSE and A level, but don't panic, it is relevant to every inquiry question. And I've put it on the Padlet. So if you go through it, the great thing that it's got is a checklist of what an inquiry question needs to include. So it needs to have a location, it needs to have a context, it needs to be, it has a word, a command word. But if you look at that, you can look at your question and say, right, is this actually an inquiry question? Are we actually going to be able to get to an end result? Are we going to come up with an answer? We'll be able to collect data. We'll be able to present it. And it's a good way of just focusing you in on that. But I'm going to go through some ones here, some examples here, so that you can use these if they're relevant for you. And hopefully then you'll get an idea of what you mean by inquiry. So thinking about some historical, these are geographical process inquiries, or they could be historical inquiries, but they're using the inquiry method, and that's what's important. So all the tables are going to have the inquiry question, the method you're going to use, so how you collect your data, the equipment you might need. All of the equipment is things you will have in school. Do not go out and buy loads of data, loads of expensive equipment. There's some stuff I would recommend, like anemometers, so measuring the weather. That's a really useful equipment to have. Most of them you should have in school anyway, or they're cheap. For some of them, I've said what results you might expect, and other topics it might link into. But again, because the topics are so vast now, you'll probably see which ones they link into better than I can. So thinking about materials, it sounds like a science inquiry, but in fact, we're relating this to buildings, so structures in the past. So think about the Celts and the Stone Age. So what materials did they build with? So you can start to measure which one's the strongest. So you can start to relate different ages to each other. So Celtic roundhouses made out of sticks with clay and straw compared to Stone Age made out of rock. then, you know, can start to think about how progression happened. But of course, what's wrong with having, you know, you need to have your own cave, and there's not that many caves around. Coastal erosion, starting to use that process that you did in your continuous provision, starting to build those landforms, but then starting to test them, which one's going to last the longest. So if we make a nice archway and we start splashing it with water, how long is it going to take for it to be destroyed? Or we make a headland and we try and destroy that, how long is that going to take? So try and collect some data using those models to show the process. Then you can start think about, there's a lot to do with the environment. Obviously the environment is all covered in the humanities, but there's so much that requires you to really question. So are there more yellow flowers in spring? So you're starting to collect the data for that. So, and you're going through the inquiry process. Lots of these inquiries are building that really simple question, but the inquiry process is the important thing you'll get out of this. So asking that question, they can probably understand that very simply, but then say, well, how are we going to find the answer? And from that, they'll work out an inquiry process from it of collecting data and then showing that and then finding a pattern. So it's really useful to have some simple questions there as well. Where in your school grounds is the best place for wind turbines? Now, there's a lot of things that could be placed around your school grounds to help with things like sustainability or renewable energy. But finding the location is a great inquiry process that requires data collection. So that could be for wind turbines, for solar panels, or it could just be, right, I want to put a new set of benches outside, but I want to make sure that I don't get too cold and I don't get too hot from the sun and I have a nice view. So setting up some parameters for this, and then they have to explore, collect data, present it, and then find the answer to the inquiry question. Litter as well. If again, relating it to things like the weather, so the wind is moving that litter all over the place. It could be that you want to put a new litter bin out, and where's the best location for that? Or you just want to map where the litter goes so that you can try and make sure that when you're doing a litter pick, you're going to the right place so it's more efficient. Looking at your trees as well. So there's some great history with the Greeks with some of their fantastic mathematical theories that they developed, like Pythagoras and trigonometry. Now, you may not be teaching them trigonometry, but trying to get them to establish ways of measuring the heights of trees and putting themselves in the boots of these old Greek geologists and Greek mathematicians who had to find out the way to do this. It just gives them that sense of difficulty with the past if you didn't have things like calculators or equipment that they use nowadays. Habitats and eco, so much that you can do for geography inquiries. So looking at your plants, if you've got areas that are trampled, which you will have in between your goalposts, we can see what the effect is on trampling. And again, if you want to change that for different progression steps, you can just look for, is there plants there or is there not for progression step 2? And then later on, you can start to measure the height of them for progression step 3, looking for patterns. You could even map them when you get to progression step 4, looking at how far away you have to get from the goalpost before you get to full coverage and full height in your plants. Also thinking about growing conditions and the plants, where's the plants the tallest, and thinking about the weather and the aspect and the direction and things like that. Important for inquiries such as where is the tallest grass is that you're introducing ideas like sampling. Now, you're not going to measure every single plant. So how do we choose which plants to grow? How do we make it fair? So you're bringing in that fairness and that bias and also that reliability of data through sampling. Also looking at habitats as well. Habitats is also included in the humanities because you're thinking about the conditions within them. So we're not necessarily looking at the animals and how they're adapted, but you're looking at the conditions. So what conditions are there? So you might be able to measure what conditions are in the soil. So how much moisture there is there and how much sunlight comes down. And if you've got a bit of woodland, measuring sunlight, you can do that quite easily by getting cups of water, putting them same temperature, one under the trees, one in the air, and maybe in the yard, and then measuring the temperature of those two and see which one gets warmer the quickest. There's some other investigations which I like, which is looking at this tree structure and how it varies compared to whether it's got lots of light or not. So looking at the leaves, are there bigger leaves closer to the sun? If you've got small trees, you can do things like that. And then measuring light levels, the UV beads that you can get, you can use those to measure light levels, or you can get light meters. You can actually get an app now which has got a light meter. So you can use really simple technology or using the apps on iPads, and that means that you can see, you know, data collection going on, but you can use the actual natural world as your source. And then should we build a river? The houses along a river. So if you're making models, you can do some inquiries based on those models as well. Some of the history stuff provides opportunities for inquiries as well. So I love making siege machines, and if you make siege machines, you can do an inquiry saying which siege machine actually propels your propellant the furthest. So you've got a ballista versus a catapult, and you can actually fire, I suggest you fire Mentos or small marshmallows, and you see which one gets fired the furthest by the siege machine. Also with the Romans and the Greeks, you can look at aquifers, and the Victorians as well. So creating waterways to move water from one place to another. So how can you make water go in certain directions, so uphill? And that's obviously going to be linking into the rivers, but also thinking about how they made river water go uphill as well, thinking about transporter bridges, thinking about Archimedes screws. There's so much that you can bring in there of history as well. The seasons, just everything to do with the weather is a really great way of bringing in inquiry. Oh, sorry, there's a message. So anything that you can measure in terms of the weather, so temperature, rainfall, wind speed, and all that, you can create, and I really recommend you do, create a long-term database for your school. And then if you start developing that long-term database, then that's something you can use as secondary data when you start to compare it over the years. So you might have 10 years worth of data, and you can actually see maybe you've got some global climate change in your data after those 10 years. Great Fire of London, lots of schools do Great Fire of London, which is brilliant. However, if you turn it into an inquiry, it's even better. So which materials could have stopped the Great Fire of London? So you've got all your buildings for the Great Fire of London, and then if you place what you think might have stopped in between them, you can actually see whether it would have worked. So you could put a wooden building or a gap, or I wouldn't say concrete, but a stone building, something there, and you can literally see whether it would have stopped it. Also, the problem with Great Fire of London, the main reason it carried on was not just the materials, but also it was the weather conditions, all about that wind blowing. So thinking about that and measuring the wind speed and the wind direction when you're actually burning your houses, and seeing whether that speeds it up as well. So again, making it a whole immersive event, not just let's just watch our houses burn. Let's try and make the relevance of what we're doing to the actual time it happened. So thinking about what it was like then compared to what it's like today. Shelters, shelter building. Now, there's so much you can do in terms of shelter building for inquiry, but really what you're trying to get them to think about is which is the best. Now, when we go on, I'll talk about shelters in different ways in which you can link it in with other topics. But just for the inquiry process, it's thinking about how do you test it? So how do we test if it is waterproof? So they've got to come up with a method for testing it, but also thinking about how you then present that data. You know, how do we say if that one's more waterproof than that one? And you can do that in terms of roofing material, thinking about the different ages. So your Tudor houses which have got reeds mainly on their roofs, then you've got houses with slates on it, and then you've got ones with gauze on for the medieval times. So you can try and investigate which one of those would have made the most waterproof roofing. And then looking at your school grounds and thinking about where the water goes. So this is less of quantitative data and more of qualitative data. So we're looking at mapping and patterns. So you're not going to get numbers, you're going to get words or pictures. And that's important to identify a different type of inquiry that's still a really important form of data collection. So just because you haven't got numbers, which is usually what you get when you do a scientific process, you can collect qualitative data, and that's just as important in an inquiry process. And then lastly of all, I've said about the weather, but just investigating where different microclimates are, because every school has got different weather at different parts in their school grounds. So you've got windy bits, you've got dry bits, you've got warm bits, and investigating that microclimate. It's really relevant to your school, but it's also something that's happening daily differently. So it's something you can collect really good data, and you can use that to try and make sense of those big things that you're going to be explaining, things like climate. Climate is a large scale, difficult thing to get to grips with. Microclimate on a small ground in your school, you know, moving away from a tree and it getting a bit warmer, that you can get your head around. Then if you bring it into the broader global situation, then you've got that to draw back on and to actually make sense of. Also thinking about how materials, so we've got materials reflecting. If you make a solar oven, again, that's really good to look at how other countries are using their different weather for things that we could never do here. You know, yes, we can melt some ice, we can heat up a pizza, we can maybe boil an egg in a solar oven on the hottest day in this country, whereas you're going to African countries and they can use it to power their houses, they can use it for so much more, they can use it to cook everything. So it just shows the difference in the climate has a big impact, but you can see how they might be doing it. Also builds into that eco, that green and alternative energy as well. Mapping noise around your school. So how does noise vary around your school grounds? Looking at, you can look at wind, but also you can look at barriers to noise as well. And apps for decibel meters are really useful. You can get them, download them free onto an iPad, walk around, map where it is. Again, you get some quantitative data that you can then graph or put onto your map. For the lower school, so for foundation phase, you can even go around and just say, where do you think it's the noisiest? It could just be, you know, give it a number, or you could just give it a color, or a happy face for a sad face for lots of noise or not much noise. So there are ways in making these easier for progression step 1. And then lastly, these last 2 ones are more about the individual human aspect of it. So there's a big thing in geography at the moment about mapping emotions, so emotion mapping. So looking around your school grounds and basically walking around and deciding how it makes you feel, and thinking about, right, why do certain areas make you feel like that? Is that because I fell over there and I hurt my knee one time? Or over there, there's always a puddle which I love jumping in, so that makes me happy there. Or that's the buddy shot stop and I always find a friend there, so that makes me happy. So trying to look at that. And it also could feed into ways in which you can improve your school grounds. So if everyone doesn't like that area, working out why they don't like that area, and then making it better and trying to build on that as well. And then lastly, I mentioned before about observing where people go, but we could also map them. We could literally draw a line to show where people are going. Now, it could be looking for places when there's congestion. You know, everybody is going through this door at lunchtime. And you've probably done this yourself when we had COVID to try and make sure everyone was going out separate doors. But if you get them to identify the routes that people are taking, and if there's any congestion points, and thinking about ways, you know, why are people going certain ways? And of course, you can do the classic traffic survey or pedestrian count, looking outside your school grounds as well. Right, so for all of those, I have written ways in which that you can turn that into a progression step 1 inquiry, or move it to a progression step 3 inquiry, or add an extension to it. Okay, so I'm not going to necessarily go through all of these, but all of these will be on this PowerPoint. So if you do want to go through any of them in more detail, then you can see. But realistically, for progression step 1, you're just trying to limit the data collection to maybe 2 things. So in school grounds, looking at wind, we just want to know where it's the highest, where it's the lowest. So you get your wind turbine, or you get a pinwheel, and then you take it somewhere and you just see, is it going round faster? And you can count how many times it goes round if you want, or you can just say it's going faster and then the other one's going slower. Then you do a bar graph with high and low. That's what you do for progression step 1. When you get to progression step 3, you can choose locations based on the data you collect from a wind meter. So you actually get some numbers. You can start mapping it. You can start doing some actual graphing on top of your map, or you can start to do distance. So you can start to get some data that says as we get further away from the building, the wind speed actually goes up. And then when you extend that, you can then try to change from doing bar graphs to doing line graphs and scatter graphs, and trying to think about relationships between impermeable and permeable objects. So does this relationship happen when you go behind a fence, or does it happen only when you go behind a building? So you're building on that experience and trying to make sense of it in an alternative experience as well. Litter, again, in progression step 1, you're just looking at where they think it's moving and why. That's all we're going to do, just asking that question. Whereas when you get to progression step 3, you could color your map to show where the litter is accumulating, and then take some wind meter readings in those places to try and map why is it accumulating there. And then when you're talking about all the other things that I've said about finding the areas of the ground which are best for the solar panels or best for the wind turbines, you increase in complexity by getting them to try and bring in some of that business studies. So saying, right, how much energy could we actually power? And then trying to think about the design. So you'll try and go cross-curricular here. You're not going to just stick in your humanities. So thinking about the size of the panels, how many can you fit on your roof? And think about the disadvantages and, you know, why it would be good for us to have solar panels and why it wouldn't be necessarily good to have solar panels in Wales. And when we were talking about other investigations, so as I said about the trampling and the plant growth, you can change again from some really qualitative, so just crosses where the plants are on a piece of paper, to drawing a nice line graph. So you're increasing the depth and the variety of data presentation methods they've got. And then they're going to evaluate that by trying to say, well, you know, are my results accurate and reliable? And why do you think these plants are surviving? So questioning what they've actually found as well. In terms of the tallest grass, so thinking about why again, and we're going to introduce things like sampling methods. So how do we choose grasses that we're going to measure? We're not going to measure them all. So random sampling. What I like to do is to lay out a grid with one tape measure going one way, one going another way, giving them corks or numbers. You can pick out Numicon. They find a coordinate, and when they get to the middle with their partner on that coordinate, that's where they choose the plant that they're going to measure. And then they get a nice sample there. And it means they think about the bias, they're making sure that they're covering the whole area without actually choosing the plant they want. Because if they decide that they think it should be tallest, they're going to find the tallest one to measure. Right, next one. So, right, let's pick a few because I don't want to do all of them. Houses, again, we're talking about houses next to rivers. So if you start building, there's a model of a river here that some students did for me. But if you build a model of the river here and you get them to just play with the water coming down it and then put their houses, so they can put their houses right on the edge and then pour the water down and see what happens to the houses. With the older ones, for the progression step 3, we can start to actually build up some landforms. So we're talking about bringing the landforms in as well. So we've got a river valley as well. So we've got a high area. So they're choosing where they're going to put their houses. They can put them some at the top, some at the bottom, pour it down. And then obviously that's going to happen in real time very quickly. And they can start to think, well, what's going to happen in long term? So, you know, if we did this in real life, is it going to take 2 minutes, or is it going to take years, and how many years? Then they can start to draw pictures of what they think this landscape might look like in the future. And you can build from that to think about flood defenses as well. One of the things in the key considerations is all about hazards and natural hazards. And because this curriculum needs to be relevant to your learners, the natural hazard that most teachers gravitate towards is volcanoes. And yes, all children love volcanoes, but the chances of you having a volcano close to your school grounds, maybe in North Wales, but in South Wales, you're not going to have one. So trying to get them to understand about volcanoes, it's a bit abstract, really, exciting, but abstract. So go for natural hazards that make sense to them. So if your school is situated in a river valley, and you've got a river there, and sometimes the village floods, then your natural hazard should really be flooding. It shouldn't be looking at volcanoes, because the flooding makes much more sense to them. It's more meaningful. And them designing flood defenses is something that, you know, they will appreciate, because that's something that might actually happen to their houses as well. Siege machines. So again, we're looking at moving from bar graphs, but also different siege machines, how they work, why is it the best? You can link that into forces as well. And if you're thinking about aquifers, you can lead that into designing whole systems for transporting water around and experimenting and see what goes wrong and what goes right. Locating where's the driest, where is the wettest. Again, it can be just as simple as putting a big raindrop in some parts of the ground, a little raindrop on a map of the other parts. Whereas with the other ones, trying to come up with a method. How can we measure how wet this area is? You know, maybe drawing round the puddles and measuring the circumference of them, or maybe timing how long it takes for it to evaporate. So getting them to come up with methods of measuring things which are not as obvious is a really good way of embedding that inquiry process. And then the material stopping the fire of London, again, just filming it and seeing which house burnt the slowest or which one burnt the fastest. You can then relate back to that. And you could then do bar graphs for the progression step 3. So type of material and then how long it took for it to actually burn. And then think about what happened when the fire got to the end of the street. And a great extension of that is then to try and redesign Pudding Lane so that it would not spread. So assuming that the weather conditions is going to be the same, the wind is going to be staying for 3 days really strong, how can you design the baker's house so that the fire does not spread from that location? So you're bringing in lots of problem solving there as well. Right, water, right? So you could just be looking around your school ground, taking photos and finding where the wettest areas are, or you can do a chloropleth map, which is a color-coded map showing where the wettest points are. And then to extend that, you can say, right, well, does that actually relate to locations in terms of the highest land or the lowest part? And then you could try and think about how can we design a water capturing device so that we save water. The solar, if you look on the right here, this is a solar oven here. So getting them to design that and to try and make something that's actually going to cook in there. You can melt some things in there if you've got a really sunny day, but also think about where do you locate it? Where's the best place to put this in the school grounds so that it will work the best? How can you design it so it is absorbing the most? What material is going to be reflecting the most? So there's lots of coming in there, but it also relates to places where they actually use them to cook as well. And then emotion mapping, just walking around your school grounds, there's a lovely emoji symbols here on the bottom right, and getting students in progression step 1 to choose an emoji for each location, just literally sticking it on the map. When you get to progression step 3, you can get them to rate their emotions. So give them a 1 to 5 on the happiness scale for a certain location. And then for an extension, you can then try and work out, drill down the reason behind those emotions. So map things like noise level or the landscape features or the wetness. Is it because there's always a puddle there? Is it because the wind blows that way? And trying to link the mood to something in the environment. And then building on that, is there a way we could change the environment to improve the mood you have in the area as well? One of the challenges that I've been writing for my subscription service is trying to get them to redesign their school grounds to get rid of any negative mood areas. So areas that they really don't like in their school grounds, what could they do to improve it? And then designing that and then pitching that and then making it and then seeing if it worked by doing another survey of the moods of the children who were using that area. And then lastly, where do people go? Could be just literally drawing a line, showing where they're going on the map. Whereas when you get to progression step 3, you're doing an observational narrative. You're literally writing a description of what they are doing. And this works better probably in a off school grounds. So if you're watching people, you can see what they're wearing, think about their age, who's with them, why they're going to certain shops, how long they're stopping for, who they're talking to, and then trying to make the sense of their, how they feel about this location and what are they doing, what's their purpose for it, and what are they doing what are they doing with the facilities. And then you can try and make some links then, or look for some patterns. So do younger people walk faster? Are there more cars at certain times of the day? So it could be just you're looking at the movement of cars, and any kind of observation and looking for patterns as well is an extension. Right, so a lot of these inquiries as I said, linking with the science investigation, but the emphasis is really on the inquiry process. So don't worry about thinking, oh, that's a lot of, it sounds like science to me, because you're going to focus on this inquiry process. So don't worry about overlap, because of course it's all going to be cross-curricular at the moment. That's what we're all looking for. So in the what matters statement, there is this ongoing progression, which if you're a geographer, you'll be familiar with, because it's these use of these command words. And these are mentioned in all the different progression steps. And there's this consistent use of these command words at the different progression steps. And this really helps us to increase challenge and to move learners on, because we know where's the next step to go with the inquiry process. So this is the structure of progression in the command words across what matters statement 1 in the humanities. So we start with this experience and recognize at progression step 1. We move on to describing. We then go on to explaining, on to analyzing, and finally at progression step 5, on to critically evaluating. Now, these are actually the hierarchy of inquiry skills that are covered in what matters statement 1 anyway. So at the 6 stages of the inquiry process. So it means that progression in all the what matters statement involves a move from experiencing and recognizing to describing, to explaining, to analyzing, and finally to critically evaluating. So if you look out for your use of these different inquiry skills, then you know that you're going to be trying to move learners on. So once they've experienced the landscape around them, get them to describe it, then explain how it was created, then analyze the various factors inputting on it to evaluate how they and others are impacting the environment, or how the environment is impacting them. And then thinking about how you can evaluate what you've found. So is there anything, any questions that you've come up with based on what you've analysed? Did the process go well? And then thinking about that with your special considerations. So structuring your questions on any of your special considerations content, so any of the things you're covering with these command words, would mean that you are facilitating your learners and you're making sure you're giving them a deeper understanding in their skills, and know that you're progressing then. But I'll show you what that actually means in practice. So for example, in progression step 1, to experience, you might just walk around your local area and recognize landforms. So that's a river, that's a street, that's a shop. When you get to progression step 2, you do the same, but this time you're going to describe what you see. So the river is flowing down the hill. Hospital is on a busy road. The hill has no trees on the top. So making those descriptive observations. Progression step 3, you're trying to explain it. So reasons why the landforms are there and why they've changed. So the river has eroded a channel as gravity pulls it down to the sea. Then progression step 4, you're considering how and why the landscape might have changed over time. So why have things changed? So we talk about your school building. Why has it changed, and why is that? How's that impacted the environment and the landscape? And then when you get to 5, we're evaluating the evidence for your conclusions. So how has the economic, social, political practices impacted the natural world? So this is the process that we're going to be going through in order to make sure you've got progression. Right, so that's what matters statement 1, which is the biggest what matters statement. Has anybody got any questions on the inquiry process? We'll have a quick drink. Okay, so moving on to the other what matters statement. So you'll be pleased to hear that I've actually covered an awful lot of the content of what matters 2, 3, and 4 anyway through the inquiry process. And much of the content can actually be taught through inquiry. So it's really, the inquiry process is probably one of the best vehicles for teaching everything in the humanities. So what I'm going to focus on is the aspects that I haven't covered yet, which are going to be taught outdoors, and ones that are activities which are not necessarily inquiry based. So I won't be focusing on the inquiry as such. So progression, what matters statement 2 is all about opinions. So that seems like a weird one to have, but what we're talking about is sort of comparing and inferring different people's opinions. So a lot of this can be covered through debating, but it also can be covered through the inquiry process. Think about using questionnaires to get people's opinions, looking for evidence in the outdoors of how things were in the past. But what I'm going to focus on in this is this effect of different viewpoints. So we're thinking about how different people relate to different aspects in the past and the present day. And so a great way of inspiring these debates on how different people feel about different things is to try and reconstruct items from the past outdoors and experiment with them. Now, this allows you to identify and interpret how the people of the past struggled when they were building these objects. It also provides you room for debate, as you're not going to give them a set of instructions on how to build a ballista or a trebuchet because they didn't have them then. So it really, everyone's got to express their opinion. They've got to value each other's when they're undertaking this task. So there's so much debate going on that any of these activities are going to be covering this What Matters statement. But the important thing is that you're thinking about what you've learned and the evidence from the history of these items that you're creating. You're trying to make them authentic, but through building them, you're learning the difficulties of the time of them actually creating them. So building siege machines, again, there's a lovely one here on the right. That's a big one, but you can make them tiny with elastic bands and little boxes and toothpicks. There's lots of instructions online, but it's getting them to think about things like connection. How do you connect the materials together? They're not going to have elastic bands. So what would they have used? What materials would have been available for them? What resources? You know, they would have used natural materials. So trying to work out what in the nature is useful for using a string, using strong bits of string or rope as well. Thinking about houses. There's so many houses you can build in models, and I've done all of them with students. They absolutely love it. But the important thing is the debate they're having as they're doing it about the problems they're finding, but also trying to make it authentic. So when you're creating a roundhouse, you're going to do a wattle outside with willow. You're then going to cover it with mud and straw. You'll usually live out the poo to make the walls. But then you've got the problem of the roof. How do you keep the roof up? You need to make a structure to keep it up. And that brings in lots of problem solving, but also they're debating how it would be done. And how did we find out? Thinking about the evidence. There's not a lot of Celtic evidence around, and roundhouses don't exist anymore. They've all been completely gone because they were made of natural materials that decomposed. Tudor houses, again, thinking about the houses we've done for the Fire of London, mostly you've been making them probably out of cardboard, but of course they would have been made out of wood. So making models of those with your sticks being your half trees for your half tree houses. And then again, trying to think about the structure. You know, they had these very square ones and the roofing material. So really trying to break down the actual materials they were using and why. Same goes for big things like Roman forts and castles. If you identify the key features to a Roman fort or to a castle and then try and create a model version of it with those features within it, then it really embeds their understanding of what a fort was, you know, important aspects of it. Also thinking about location. Where would you actually locate your fort or locate your castle so it was the most defensible place? Roman mosaics, I love to use leaves and cut them out and then trying to fit them together to make a mosaic pattern. You can make some fantastic ones. But again, how difficult would that have been to try and, you know, break and create each one of those little mosaic tiles and make it into a fantastic mosaic? Roman roads, very, very distinct structure within a Roman road, getting them to do all the layers with the stones and the gravel, and then get them to try and work out why they didn't go around corners, because it's very hard. And then they're experiencing it and seeing why it's so difficult, and then they'll understand why. Rivers, again, modeling a river, you can see what happens when a storm actually occurs. So building a river, making it meander, putting in all the landscape features, but then pouring water down it and seeing what happens. You can then make sense of why you might not want to build your house on the inside of a meander, and you might want to put it on the outside of a meander or at the top of the valley. So actually, you know, seeing what happens to those buildings as they get washed downstream. Same for earthquakes. You're not going to experience that, but if you put it on a tray, you can make an earthquake proof house, and then you shake the tray and see how earthquake proof it actually is. Coastlines, again, creating that coastline and then trying to speed up time by eroding it, seeing what would happen to those buildings who were sitting on the edge as the sand slumps. Sand is brilliant for doing erosion modeling, because it does exactly what coastlines do, but on a much faster scale. So you can see the slumping. They will do exactly what coastlines will do. So it's really powerful to see that image and then watch a film of it on the larger scale, because they can see, oh yeah, that's actually what I saw. And doing some videoing of this and then getting them to narrate what's happening. It's a really powerful way of them observing, but also making sense of using the right terminology, the right geography. Flood prevention measures. So you've got your river and you've built your houses and you've decided where they're going, but how can you make sure the river doesn't flood? So trying to design some flood prevention measures. And again, thinking about if it's relevant to their houses, then this might be something that they really want to know, because they can actually do it to reduce their flooding. So sandbags, etc. So having a go and actually testing these things out. Volcanoes. Now, I've said before about, you're not going to see a volcano, but if they are building models of volcanoes, try and get them to build an actual volcano that exists. So they're try and build an Etna or a Vesuvius. So try and build it and get the structure right, get the angles right. So it actually is more meaningful than just make a volcano. So if we can try and make one that is a model of a real volcano, even if it was, say, one that is extinct, that is near your, if you're in North Wales, so an extinct volcano, or Cadair Idris, say, do that, then you could see what it was like in the past and you can make it actually explode. So you make it more meaningful than just let's just build a volcano. 5 London, I've said before, but yeah, much more than just burning it out, actually trying to put yourself in that position. I know it's probably, it's quite difficult, but if you've got older Key Stage 2 students and they're trying to actually visualize what it was like to be inside that house when that house was on fire, and that's all your belongings, you can get out because it's not going that fast, but all your belongings, everything you own is inside that house. So that visualization while you're actually watching it is going to be more powerful than just, oh, let's watch all the houses burn. Victorian invention, what I love to do with this is to try and get them to be to be those inventors from the Victorian times. So giving them the problems that the Victorians had of getting water from A to B. How do you do it? They have to go through the whole process of trying to come up with a solution to the problem. And that's exactly what the Victorians were doing. And they may not have seen an aquifer or an aqueduct or a swing bridge. So they might come up with completely different ideas. But again, it's them putting themselves in that position of, right, we don't know how to get from A to B. We need to build some structure here. How are we going to do it? What can we use? Again, for the pyramids, you're not going to take them on a field trip to Egypt unless you're a very, very nice school. And, building the pyramids is something that requires an awful lot of engineering, and they use some amazing, simple machines. So getting them to move items which are very heavy using these simple machines like rollers and inclined planes, and actually getting them to pull it, being the slaves, again, much more meaningful than just building a small model of it, just trying to move something very, very heavy. Air raid shelters, again, if you've actually got air raid shelters in your school grounds, amazing. But if you could build something that looks vaguely like it and then have a day when they have air raids going off and then they send them into the air raid, putting some sound effects there, sitting in the air raid with the bombs coming down, again, much more immersive than just hearing about it. So trying to make somewhere that you can actually recreate this is really powerful. There's also traditional crafts and ancient skills that you can challenge your students with trying, and it will really give them an insight into how people in the past lived, and also the type of objects and things and facilities that we really take for granted. And some of these are things that these people would have to do, the children, every single day, and your students probably won't have the opportunity to do it. So for World War II, but also for the medieval times, you've got things like rushlights. So this in the middle with the flame, this is a rushlight. And these were used before candles, and in World War II they were used because they didn't have much wax. But creating them is a great bit of processing of natural materials and using natural materials to create something. And you know, these would have been the only source of light they may have had. So you would have been making so many of these, but it's a really good immersive experience to have a go at making these. Getting the children to create their own playground games, but also introducing them to the old ones from the Victorian times, the hoops and tops and things like that, and exploring those and see how they think. Bows and arrows is, I know you might not want to necessarily have your students making bows and arrows, but the actual process of making them is very, very difficult to do it properly. Things like fletching arrows is a fantastic activity, fine motor skills, using feathers, or putting feathers on the end of a shaft of an arrow, tying it on. It's really tricky. Though imagine they'll probably take them a good hour to make one. And of course, one arrow is not really that useful. So it just gives you that sense of, oh my goodness, if I'm going to be an archer or going to find my own food and actually fire an arrow and actually get my own meal by using this, I'm going to have to make so many more of these, or defend the castle. How many of these am I going to have to make? Also, there's a picture on the top right with the one school we did Romans. So I taught them how to march and they created their own shields, and we did turtling. And again, things like marching, chances are, you know, these are year threes, they're not, you know, had the opportunity to do it, but trying to get them to march. And what we did, we reenacted the battle between the Celts and the Romans. And the Celts were just all over the place, running madly, screaming. And the Romans were really disciplined, you know, staying in formation, and you know, gets that sense of that difference between different types of people in the past and how those battles would have actually taken place. Archaeological dig. Again, I've said creating this area, but again, it's that sense of discovery that you can find, and all that stuff that if you can dig, you can bury things that they have no idea what they are. They can try and identify what it is, but also they can start to catalogue it. So like an archaeologist, try and catalogue by drawing, by identifying, by noting down if there's bits missing, and it gives that really good observational skills. Building shelters. A great way to relate this to more than just let's build a shelter is relating it to houses. So you could relate it to homelessness, you can relate it to mud huts or other really simple buildings used in other parts of the world. Also things like refugees, to shanty towns. Think about refugee camps and what materials they would have used. So there's so much more you can bring into this. There's a great thing, charity called Shelter Box, and there's some great resources on their website that just brings to life what it's like to be a refugee. And it's quite impactful, but actually reading something like that while they're in a shelter that they've built, trying to get them to feel, it's exciting being it, but imagine if you had to live in this and this was going to be your life because you had no home. It's really quite powerful to use that experience in that way. And then survival skills, brilliant way of teaching resilience, but also thinking about what it was like in the past, but also in places where they aren't as developed. So fire lighting, cooking on the fire, foraging for plants, medicine uses of plants, so much that you can do in terms of those survival skills. And I've done a Celts Day when we've done weaving, so that's twig weaving on the bottom right. In the middle, we've also done dyeing. So this is dyeing with woad. So we grew woad and then we made woad plants and we turned it into dye. We also had natural paints. So we used things like turmeric and also onion skins. So you can use that to dye things, and also stinging nettles. Cordage, brilliant skill. So cordage is string, and you can make that from stinging nettles or brambles or raffia. And again, good skill to have, but the fact that you use so much string to create something like a ballista or your shelter, you would have to weave and process every single bit of that before you could build your house. So it just highlights how much more difficult it would have been than for them to say, can I have another piece of string, please? So really, opens their eyes to that. Pewter casting is a fantastic activity. If you have the opportunity, you get lead-free pewter, although all pewter is lead-free now. You heat it up on the fire, and if you make yourself a mold out of cuttlefish bones, you cut in the shape. I do as arrowheads. They pour in and it's great, you're looking at states of matter as well, so a bit of science in there, but then it cools down and you have this lovely, you can make a medallion or something to go on a necklace, or you can make a shape of any kind, but then that would be the tip of your spear, the tip of your arrow. So you're building in all of these skills that they needed in order to create their defensive arrows, in order to defend their castle or to defend their home or to catch their prey. So it builds in all of these things that needed for just the survival of some of these people in the past. And tracking as well. So again, if you're trying to find your own food, you need to find out where it's gone. So trying to track, or also if you're trying to find people, or you find your way. So using tracking to look for footsteps and things like that, that's really good. Some great games you can do with that. And then last of all, this lady in the middle, she's got a box on her head. She's got a pinhole camera, or a camera obscura. So looking at the development of things, more modern history. So things like cameras, you can make pinhole cameras or camera obscuras out of things like, you can do wheelie bins or just cardboard boxes, and then go outside and you can see this, the way in which the image is then being rotated, but just gets you away from something like a phone that we're so used to clicking with, to see the actual fundamentals within it. So anything really that brings alive the life of the past will help them to have an opinion of what it was like to live in those times. So if you can have a day when you're in an air wage shelter or a Victorian, then you can bring in all of these, and it's a great immersive opportunity, especially for a launch day. If you covered as many of these, they'll get to choose what they wanted. So really the opportunities are endless if you use your outdoors, and it's really quite hard to provide an authentic historical experience when you're surrounded by modern devices and sounds. When you're inside, much more easy to do it outside. Is there any questions for What Matters Statement 2? No? Right, okay, we are getting there. So next one, What Matters Statement 3 is all about the natural world. So quite straightforward in terms of probably the things that you'll recognize as geography. But what we're looking at really is all about the human's interaction and effect on the natural world. So it's not necessarily what you would expect. So we're covering physical geography and human geography. And really importantly, we've got this sense of place and space. So we're looking at spatial patterns, significant spaces. And again, going from progression step 1, we're starting to recognize things, then describe them and explain and analyze them when we get to the higher progression steps. So it's really important here to bring in the key consideration of Kenfin. I hope I'm saying it right. So this Kenfin, this is defined as the place where we feel we belong, where the people and landscape around us are familiar, and the sights and sounds are reassuringly recognizable. So it's not really just about a geographical place, but it brings in the history, the culture, the social, and also the community that actually inhabits it. So it's a very small word, but the concept is pretty huge. And it comes into the What Matters Statement 4 when we look at community as well. So this is really approached in outdoor learning through this geographical lens that I mentioned at the very beginning. So we can reflect on other aspects to make space, but we can do it through the inquiry process as well. So what we can do is we can investigate this sense of place for the learners and their community by basically going out and asking people, talking to them. So questionnaires, interviews, investigate the local community and ask them what they think about the local area. And this doesn't have to be anything too complicated. You could come up with just questions that they ask. And if you don't want to go out to your local area, what's a great way is getting people who come into your school but are not that well known. So your governors, or maybe your lunchtime assistants, or maybe old members of staff. So people who live locally that aren't necessarily that well known to the children, but they can come and they can give them questions without you having to go off site necessarily. A great activity to do is to, if you look at the past, if you've got any old members of staff or students who've came through the school system and then they've gone, or even if they come back, and ask them to take you on a tour of your school grounds so that they can say, oh yes, that was there, and oh, I remember when the roundhouse fell down, and oh, I remember when we had sports day there, oh, I remember when we set fire to that. So they can bring it to life through their experience, and they can show you how the grounds have changed. And that's really impactful, having an old student or an old member of staff, as in the past, coming in to relay their opinion and their experience of that place. Obviously, you've got historical photos. You might have a good, I went to a school that had an amazing array of old photos for their local area and their school. But if you can find some and keep them somewhere, that's a really great resource for you to use. But there's also Google Maps Street View going back in time that you can use if you haven't got great pictures. So there are some out there. You can find out what it used to look like from above, even if you haven't got Street View going into your school. But also it's all about asking a lot of questions about a space. So just what is it like? So that's that describing, and where is it? So locating it. Best way to do that, put on Google Earth, big planet, and then just go in until you get to the actual location, then go outside and see it. So you're relating it to that sense of space. How is it changing? So even if they've only been in school a few years, as things changed while they were actually in their school. And how has it affected them? You know, did they like the changes? How do they feel about it? So there's a lot of questions you could ask just about your school grounds, but then you can bring it to the wider local space as well. Then if you ever go on a trip, lots of people go on trips and field trips and do a narrative when they come back. But would be a really nice thing, there's one on the right here, is to not just create a narrative, but get that sense of place booklet. So you're creating a sense of place through a variety of mediums. So it could be a poem, it could be stickers, it could be a map, it could be a picture, anything at all. But it's giving them that idea that a sense of place can be created from you experiencing a location and then you relaying what you feel about it in many different forms. So it's not just a map, it's not just a narrative, it could be in any form you like. It's all relevant to that kind of thing, that sense of place. Obviously, when we're thinking about maps, we can land use map. So if you look at Google Maps, if you go and look on a high street, there's lots of white blocks, which is a perfect base map for a land use map. So what you do is you take that somewhere and then you look at the map and then you look at real life and then you color in the different squares as a coded version of what land use they are. So it could be that one's a hospital or one's a shop and one's a restaurant. And then you can do that. And again, if you create a nice database of that, you can then do that in 10 years time and see how it's changed. And that's your data from your students and you're using it as secondary data, which is really, really powerful. You can do photos again, you can do video or digital photo scavenging hunts. So if you take photos in your school grounds, but from weird angles, so they can try and find where the photo was taken. And if you're looking at some navigation skills, you can get them to say which direction you're actually looking at when you took the photo with a compass. If you have the possibility of going on local visits and find some significant buildings, so if in a built up area, if you go to the local mosque, or go to the local church or museum or old buildings and try and think of some kind of heritage trail of where you could visit to see the maximum amount when you're wandering around. Or if you've got a rural settlement or a rural area and you're bringing people in, or you can visit their farms, again, you're making your sense of place, this kind of thing, relevant to your learners. It's best to do that within your local community. So if you've got farmers' children, then you visit a farm and that's much more meaningful because that's their sense of place more than if you then go and visit London, because that's not their sense of place. So we're talking about this sense of place in a local scale. And then you can create a model of that area. So make a model, a 3D model of your local area, identifying those key important factors and features. On a more basic level, you could just choose 5 words to describe your locality. You could create landscape poetry. You can use words that describe it to actually form the shape of it. So you've got a bit of expressive arts in there. But there's so much you can do, but it's so important that you get this kind of fed into them. So it's from their point of view. You don't force it down a certain avenue because this is something that's relevant to them. They'll only have that belonging if they feel that they're listened to and it's relevant to them. So we're going to focus on landscape, But also, of course, you've got the built up environment and how this changes over time as well. So this is part of this What Matters Statement 3. So we're going to start by just recognizing landform and doing field sketches, like I said before. Great way of doing a really good understanding of what you see, making models, as I said before, identifying them, labeling those different locations and those different landforms, and then investigating how rivers change over time or as you have storms, and coastal landform modeling. So all of this that I've mentioned in the previous ones, this is all covered here in these landforms, volcanoes, and then mapping the landscape around your school grounds. So there's a bump in here. I found a great idea the other day about teaching about contour lines. So lining up people along the top of that and joining them with a string, and then lining up people at the same level along the outside and then joining that up with a string. And you can get a really good visualization of what contours actually mean by mapping things like that lump in that ground. So a great opportunity to show contour lining and the patterns you have when you have different shapes in it. And landscape, and yes, if you can identify what landscapes you've got around your school grounds and name them, even if they're on a smaller scale than what you're actually trying to teach. And other things which I haven't put there is things like following the route of a raindrop. So imagine you're a raindrop. This is what I do with my students. I say, right, imagine you're a raindrop and I want you to just go. And then they wander the way they think the raindrop will go. And then every now and again, I'll stop them and say, right, why did you go that way? As they're explaining, well, I've gone down this hill here and I'm soaking into the ground to feed the plants, and I'm going up the roots and into the stem of this tree. So identifying the ways in which things move around your school grounds, which aren't actually the people there. So that interaction with the natural world as well. Oh, I missed one. Yes. Right, so I think, yeah, those are all the attributes for the What Matters Statement 3. Is there any questions on that? I'm sure I've missed a slide there. Oh well. Right, so there's a few other things that I will mention when we get on to the next one. So we're talking about any questions from everyone? Sorry, I know I am going very fast. There's a lot to cover. So what Matters Statement 4, we're talking more about the history side of it. So history, society, identity, and governance. So some of these I've already covered in activities in What Matters Statement 2, such as similarities and differences between people living in the past. So I'm not going to go back over that. But you can also, the present can be explored by looking at differences in your local space compared to other locations. So, so we're talking about chronology here. So trying to get that sense of time, but we also need to think about that sense of community as well. So that kind of thing goes through to the What Matters Statement 4 as well, and how things have affected your community and how they've changed based on those things changing in the past. Now, one aspect that I'm not even going to mention, because I don't think you can teach it outdoors and I don't think it's relevant to what I'm talking here, is about the governance. So I'm not going to be doing anything about how to teach about governance. Oh, there we go. So how do we teach What Matters Statement 4? Really importantly is that you need to find the history inside your school grounds. Now, you could be really lucky to have, like they have in this school in Warwick, a Roman villa underneath your school grounds. And if you look at some old maps, you might find there are some amazing things really close to your school grounds. But again, this is something that's individual to your school. So it's not something that you can take from anywhere else. But if you can make it really personal, then you can really find the relevance to it. And a great way of doing that is to set up like an archaeological dig. So just laying out an area and then letting them dig in it. And then if they find things there, great. It could be that they're coins, it could be bits of clay, it could be anything, it could be nothing. But the fact that they're actually digging down into their school grounds to actually look for things, basically, I'm thinking of time team sort of thing. You're actually trying to do your own timeline in your school grounds. Now, you might find that you've got a timeline in your school ground of things anyway. And one really good way of looking at timelines in your school grounds is looking at phenology. So this tree here has got tree rings, and it's been identified the dates where those tree rings actually were. So if you look for a big log, if you've got a tree that's been cut down, and you've probably got a lot this year because of ash dieback, if you know when they were chopped down, if you can label that date on the outermost ring, you can then start to use phenology, which is looking at tree rings to study what things were like in the past. You can then identify key dates on that log and on those rings. And you can look for changes in the thickness of the rings to see if it was a good year for growing or a bad year for growing. But also you can put key things there as well that might be relevant to your school, when the school was built, when you had a certain summers or certain winters that were really harsh in your location. Could be when something else was happened in your school grounds. So it's, again, you write it relevant to yours. So you're creating this timeline, and which is only relevant to your school and your students. Other things that you can map around your school ground, you can map sound as well, or you can map smells. So this is an aroma wheel here. So again, we're making this sense of place in your school grounds and thinking about what changes as you go round. So this aroma wheel here is actually American. So some of it is not relevant. So I've used it as school grounds, but some of them are gone, oh, what's a skunk and what's bleach smell like? But creating your own version of this, you walk around your school grounds, and when you smell something, you color in that map the color that you've decided that smell should be. And then based on that, you create a choropleth map, which is a map with lots of colors in it, and you can see how these colors change and how either the smells or the sounds change as well. And it's great because you can relate that to things like wind directions when you're doing smell, and if you're doing sound, you can relate it to also barriers to sound. So it really gets that sense of place. And again, it will change over time. You know, if you're in a rural area, sometimes you're going to get some, nasty smells coming. Other times of the year, you might get nice smells. So it will change over time. And that's a great way of them thinking about how your location changes over time as well. Emotion mapping, I've mentioned already. But again, if you relate that to things like your smell and your sense of place and that kind of thing, then it makes it more, you might change their emotion by getting that better connection, by discovering what it was like in the past. And again, land use mapping your school grounds, looking at key attributes. So you obviously can, put where your classrooms are and where the play areas are, but is there other things that you could put in that might be important, or things you might want to improve? And again, you're helping with the mapping skills as well. And then the rephotography that I've mentioned before, again, if you've got things in your school grounds, you can rephotography. But another really good way of identifying changes over time is thinking about the life of a tree. So one place, many stories. So this tree that's been chopped down, think about what it was like when that tree was a sapling and how it grew up and what has it seen. And that's a nice narrative that you get, like the life of a tree. So the view that tree saw through the 100 years that it was alive. And you could even recreate that into a film or into a narrative of the story of that tree or the story of our school grounds. But it's all coming into getting that sense of place and in terms of the history of a location as well. Right, that is What Matters Statement 4. As I said, there's things that I've covered in other areas that feed into that as well. Any questions on What Matters Statement 4? Nearly there. Okay, right, last one then. What Matters Statement 5, responsibilities, rights and behaviour. There's a lot there, but most of it we're going to be concentrating on the bottom two things, which is all about creating something in the environment, so having a positive impact. So it's a lot about rights, responsibility, decision-making, behaviour, but we're going to be focusing on this positive action, this community involvement, this environmental responsibility and the sustainable futures. That's the aspects that really will link in with outdoor learning. So the important part of this that we can cover is that bit at the very end. So I've got some ideas for you to do, but again, it's going to be really relevant for your location and your community. It's not something that somebody can tell you what you should do. And it's got to be really led by the students and also by the community that you've got. So this is a community engagement project, and that's really what they've got in those 3 statements down the bottom of the What Matters Statement 5. And this is a huge project, or a huge opportunity for you to bring in so many skills that we've mentioned in the inquiry process, but also that kind of that sense of space, that responsibility, those opinions, everything comes into this community engagement project. So it could really be the pinnacle, the end point of learning all those other skills and content from the other What Matters statement. It's really important that you talk to the locals and you find out what they want. Obviously, you can do your engagement project in your school grounds, and your community can be your other learners, so the other year groups. But if you can go wider, then that's obviously going to be great for your school as well. And so talk to the locals, undertake a survey, undertake questionnaires, and then ask the locals what they think about the area, but then ways in which they think it could be improved. And then it could be that they just say, oh, we could really do with a crossing across the road because I can't get around across the road. And then you write letters to your local councillors and to them, trying to persuade them to put in a new crossing, and you design a new crossing and you try and survey the cars going it, and you get some speed data. So it builds in with a big project like that. Also, you could just find out about the past of your area. Maybe there's aspects of the past that have just been lost to time. And for that, you could maybe create some information boards depicting what the area was like in the past and put them up somewhere in a prominent place so that people are more educated about the past that people haven't been told about. Anything that inspires your students, obviously. It could be that you get them to design new street furniture because there's just not enough of it, or it's not fit for purpose. If you can get them to build flower beds or plant them up because there's not enough greenery there, or it's all a bit grey and drab, or there's nowhere for them to play, so they could design play equipment or design a skate park or adventure playground. So building on what comes out of the survey. It could be that accessibility is poor. So if you do an accessibility survey, you're looking for issues for disabled people, maybe people who are wheelchair bound, maybe people who can't see. So looking for things like bumps in the ground so that they can tell where to cross the road, dips in the curb so that they can go down off the pavement onto the road, opening doors that they don't open outwards. So lots of ways in which you can see whether it's accessible to disabled people. And then you suggest improvements to the county council based on what you've seen. And also it could be just that you're improving the visual of an area by creating a sculpture or piece of artwork, which you then give to your community and you place there. So it's a huge thing. You could be anything you like, but it's nice to give them that opportunity to bring in that inquiry process as well. On top of that, you could come up with a creative solution. Now, this is where we get really big. We're talking about these big sustainability issues. But if we want our learners to be creative problem solvers, we need to give them some really difficult questions, which they're going to have to actually answer in the real world. And you never know, they might just come up with a solution. So come up with a creative solution to some local problem, or it could be some really big global problem. And again, you could survey the local people and find out what they have issues with. So maybe finding out about their relationship with the natural world, maybe there's some misconceptions there. Maybe the students could help with making things a bit better by improving their understanding, by presenting something, creating a film, explaining why it should be, they should put their rubbish in the bin, or they shouldn't be using carrier bags or anything at all. Again, so for example, if they're doing climate change, they could look at air pollution, noise pollution, light pollution, or the traffic. So they use this evidence to create an education campaign to bring to light the problems that have been created by people's behavior. So they could make a film, as I said, a poster, or even letters, or a press release to the local government and saying, people seem to be doing this, they need more education. We think that they should learn about this. This is going to help them, and this will be the end result. So again, another big project. Sustainability is another way in which we could try and empower our students to understand that they can make a difference, but also they can understand something even though it's a huge topic. So we've said about surveys, microclimate surveys over time, looking at the impact of the urban environment on things like heat, so temperatures of tarmac compared to temperatures of grass, and wind speeds, so wind behind buildings compared to wind where there isn't a building. So just seeing how these structures are changing the climate on a small scale, you can then build into that global climate change as well, because global climate change is not just about temperature going up, it's changing the climate. So we've got urbanization impacting that as well. Litter survey, again, looking at stuff that's that's going to decompose, that stuff that isn't, how long it stays out there, and again, ways in which we could try and reduce the litter problem. Again, really creative problems is what we're looking for. Investigating air and noise pollution. I've said about noise, but air pollution, you can put up double-sided sticky tape onto lamp lights, so street lights outside your school, and see how much dark black stuff, which is particulate matter, is attracted on that over a few days. Compare that to somewhere away from the road, and then again use that to try and say, right, well, is it because the cars are going too fast? Is it because the cars are going too slow? Is it because there's too many cars? Is it the type of car? So try and investigate and drill down to why there is that. Water saving, so try and work out ways of saving water in your school grounds. It could be water butts, but it could also be being, more efficient in the way they use the water inside as well. Watering your plants, how are you going to make sure that's not a waste of water? How are you going to make sure you use it most effectively? And then electricity generation, I said about the inquiry of finding out solar panel use or wind power use, but if you could think about geothermal as well, using some of that water coming down the drain pipes to generate electricity as well with a hydroelectric. But thinking about temperature changes, a ground source heat pump, is that going to be possible in your school grounds? And then lastly of all, again, another way of bringing the problems of global climate change to you is a lot about the forest fires that have been going on in America and also in parts of England as well, thinking about what would happen if you had a forest fire in your school grounds and what effect would it have. So again, trying to bring this to life without scaring them too much. Last thing, so that was our What Matters Statement 5. And the last thing I want to go through, and this is going to be very brief because I could go through lots and lots of ideas for this, but teaching geographical skills is key to one of those key considerations, which isn't on the What Matters statement. So we really need to drill down these skills of learning how to use a map. And I do this from nursery all the way up to A level. And it's a proper progression. It's very easy to increase progression and increase challenge because you get more and more accurate. You use more and more techniques that are using much more maths and less observational data. So it's a fantastic way of increasing progression. Start with journeying, so going from A to B, so walking from one end of your school grounds to the other, and just like this map on the ground here, or the middle here, sensory trail of the school grounds, just identifying what you see and what's it like as you go from A to B. You can create journey sticks by getting a stick, and as you go along, pick something that represents that area, tying it on with string or with elastic bands, and then you're getting that sense of location relating to what is there. And then when you start to turn that into maps, so we've got a linear map there, we're starting to then go into a 2D map, start to just give them the opportunity to create it, but also it's all about observation. So you go around looking for shapes first of all, and looking for shapes is the starting point to create a map, and using loose parts is a great way of making maps. And I've done it with every year group, and when they're in nursery and reception, it's just about the key identifying features. So the school and the grass, that's fine. Then when you get onto the progressive step 1, 2, 3, and 4, you're starting to think about location, thinking about scale, thinking about the resources they use that represent the landforms, thinking about the shape of the land, thinking about using the shape of the land they're building their map on to represent the actual landforms in real life. When you get on to year 6, you can then turn that into some scaled maps, and having a scaled map of your school ground is a really useful tool for you to teach mapping in all year groups, but also for doing maths trails, literacy trails, and everything else. So to do a scaled map, Google Earth is great for that. You just look at Google Earth, either print it off or trace round it, measure what it is on Google Earth, measure what it is on the ground, work out the difference, and then you know that you can work out the differences between the locations on your piece of paper, and then you know what it will be on the ground as well. And once you've got that scaled map, you can then teach them all the skills of navigation that you might want. And the best place for doing those is using the outdoor learning cards from the OEAP, the orienteering skills. There's brilliant progression through there, starting with orientating your map so you know it's facing the right way, on to finding key locations, so doing a treasure hunt, placing it somewhere, putting a cross on a map. They then have to find it, going to that cross, putting grid references on your map. So you give them a grid reference, they then have to find that location, pick up something, bring it back. And so all of those builds into some great map work. And then from that, you've got compass work and compass skills. The amount of students that think they know how to use compasses, but they actually don't. Really useful skill to learn. And even if you're just starting with the basic, that's north, that's south and east and west, and locating your map in the right direction, that's a starting point. And then you go on to teach them how to use a compass. Then they can use that to find their way, looking at directional language as well. And that's very whistle stop how to teach mapping outside. This is so much more I could put there. For an awful lot of the activities that I've mentioned, I've actually made videos on YouTube for students, for learners. I did it over lockdown, but they're for learners that can use it in their school grounds, even though it says all about using it in your garden. They're all relevant to using it in your school grounds as well. So is there any questions at all about any part of the humanities AOLE? I know there's an awful lot to take in there. Feel free to unmute and talk if you don't want to chat it. Okay, fab, brilliant. Right, so last bit then, bit of resources to help you. So my outdoor challenge cards, which are available on Nature Day's website. I've got humanities ones. I've only got 4. I need to do some more, I think, but you can buy those separately, or you can buy the whole pack for £50. I'm just sorting out my subscription service, which if you buy into that, you'll get lesson plans and loads of ideas for teaching all of the Welsh curriculum to all of the year groups. That is the link for the Padlet. So if I stop sharing and show you the Padlet, then, so if I show you the Padlet, then you can see what I mean about where the stuff is. Okay, so this is the Padlet here. So if you click on that link, you'll see every single aspect of outdoor learning so far. We're building up a nice reserve here. And at the very end, so far, we're down to here. So this is humanities. So this is my geography inquiry tool that I created. And these are my videos on building a timeline, sound mapping, reef photography. So lots of these activities I've mentioned today, I've done videos on. So there's much more detail in there. And they're all child friendly. So they're for students to work with. So you can get them to look at those. So loads of those. And then we got instructions for making ballistas, weather equipment, aqueducts, and there's some other fieldwork ideas and some great resources from the Ordnance Survey and other things, loads of stuff there. So if you look at that, and if you've found any other resources, then please do share them with me and I'll put them onto the Padlet to share with others. So I'll just share the last bit on my PowerPoint. So last bit, if you want to, this is just to help you. If you want to start generating your own portfolio of outdoor learning, what I suggest you do is integrate some outdoor learning ideas into your humanities planning so that you've got some ideas from what I've given you today to go into that. I know there's an awful lot there. And all of this will be sent to you, the video, the recording of the video and the PowerPoint. So you can click on all of these. Please, please, please do fill in the feedback form. I really need feedback, and every feedback form has at the end a last question which says what you want me to do next time, or which activities, which sessions you want me to repeat, because I'm actually repeating some of these now because people have been inquiring. Next week, I'm repeating the first one I did, which is starting out. I'm also repeating the maths and numeracy one and the science and the planning one as well. So if you are new to these sessions and you've missed any of them, if you look on the Eventbrite, you'll see all 20 of them. then I'm starting to repeat some of them, but I need to know what you want me to repeat. I'm not going to do them all if people aren't going to, aren't wanting them. And if you do want to buy all 20 sessions, you can get a 10% reduction and you'll get a recording from all the other sessions. And any ones I repeat, you also get free admittance to that, so you can go and see it as well. The next session is on the 2nd of March, so after half term, apart from if you're coming next week to starting out. And we're going to go through the expressive arts AOLE, and hopefully it won't be quite as frantic as this one was. So that's it. Oh my goodness, we actually made it on time. Sorry, it was fast and furious. That's a lot of content, as you can see, and hopefully once you've had time to digest it, you can fill in my feedback form, and if you want anything else, give me an email, pop me a line. You can get in contact with me through the PowerPoint presentation. So unless you have any questions, thank you very much for coming. Hopefully you're not shell-shocked, and I'll see you again soon.